Hi, thanks for inviting me. I wish I was there with you because then I wouldn't have to be here. Also, I think the number of people at the meeting who I like a lot is huge, and so it would have been fun to be there. So this is a little different, although it's shocking that it seems to fit, from in my view, very well uncoordinated with what Nabosha's talk was. And so the title is something about pain therapeutics. The gist of this talk, if you put it together with Nabosha's talk, is when you find biomarkers in a tissue or in plasma, but better in a tissue, for something you're studying that you care about, a question is whether that thing is merely correlated with the condition or is it causal. And I'm going to show you complete proof that you can get causality out of SomaScan if you get a lot of help from somebody else. Okay, I'm not going to spend any time on this one. This is a new company here in Colorado that worked on this with us for the last 7 or so years. So this is a fair amount of work together. And prior to that, the guy who is the founding scientist of this thing has worked on this problem for 30 years. So science can take a long time, but I think this man, Scott Fauci, did something quite remarkable. So here's the summary, and actually I'll flip ahead. If Actually, this is everything I'm going to say, really. It's like a pre-summary. Um, all the stuff on the left, Nabosha just talked about. We made this SomaScan thing, and today we measure about 7,000 proteins. The data I'm going to show you today is an earlier version. It's 5,000 proteins. We've run SomaScan on lots of human samples, maybe 500,000. And we're beginning to sort of understand what we learn in these experiments. And Nabosha's group, he didn't say much about that, but at the bottom bullet on the left, Nabosha and his wonderful group is going to get to a number bigger than 7,000 in a short time. The right side is a little bit about this guy, Scott, it's all about this guy, Scott Fauci, who's a neurosurgeon who has studied deeply for 30 years how people do after they've had a very, very bad spinal cord injury. And, and to my surprise, he has ended up studying pain rather than paralysis, because paralysis is more or less done, it's fixed more or less when you, at the time of your injury, although you can get a little better, sometimes you get a little worse. But the real thing that happens to people with even severed spinal columns is that they experience pain. And pain turns out to be a big deal for these patients. And the middle bullet on the right side of this thing is a testimony to what Scott did, is he figured out the causal tissue for pain, and he figured out all by himself that by ablating that causal tissue, most of these paralyzed patients, 85% is a real number, from a few hundred patients, go from being paralyzed with awful pain to still being paralyzed, but with less pain and sometimes no pain. So that's what I'm going to tell you about. And of course, it's going to interface with SomaScan in a minute. And you're going to see what I think is, kind of an ode to Scott Fauci. So here is Scott Fauci. Looks like a neurosurgeon to me. And it says what I just said, that over 30 years he's been studying, because when he would stabilize a spinal cord injury patient, so they didn't die. It then became clear to him, because he's a good person, and he spent a lot of time talking to patients, that the major problem they faced was not paralysis. The, the major, although that was bad, the major problem really was pain. And that's what this is about. This talk is about pain. So repeats the same sort of thing. He started at Craig Hospital where he was, and now, if I go back again, he has he's just taken a job with HCA Healthcare, who own the hospitals that he worked at in this big chain of hospitals. And they've just built him an institute called the Fauci Institute for Spinal Cord Injuries. And if you took that at face value, you would think this is a talk entirely about spinal cord injuries, but actually it's a talk about how spinal cord injuries plus SomaScan gave us the view that we could help people with pain independent of spinal cord injury. That is, think of, chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and back pain. Think of all of those kinds of pain and wonder whether or not Scott's work on spinal cord injury induced pain, it leads you to more things to help patients. That's my view, is that's where this is going. So this says the same sort of thing. We'll just go forward. So this is like summaries and summaries and summaries. The top says that Scott figured out what the causal tissue was by asking something simple. When a paralyzed patient with a big spinal cord injury has awful pain, he figured out that if he just kind of looked for something, because when he opened up these people and look at their spinal column, he could see nothing that suggested anything about pain. And then all of a sudden, from some brain warp, he decided to scan up and down the spinal column of these injured patients to measure electrical activity. And when he did that, he found that even with a severed spinal column high up, in your neck or lower, just a little lower than your neck, that somewhere below the injury there would be this hyperactive electrical current, which turned out to be coming from causal tissue. And that's what we're going to talk about. And then the middle is obvious. It's what you always do when you're at SomaLogic. You do SomaScan, which Naboisha has already told you about in great detail, wonderful detail. And then we're going to get to the point where we go from correlation, which is all you have in the first two chunks, down to actually seeing about causality. That's this talk. So same slide. So this is a reference to the key paper. By the way, my email address, I don't know if you have it, it was on the first slide. It's lgold@somalogic.com. And anyone who wants these slides can have them. Just send a note and I'll send them to you immediately. You don't have to, but if you'd like them, you can have them. I think they're kind of fun. This is the key paper from, again, Scott Fauci. And it's the first paper in which he says explicitly that if he finds this electrical hyperactivity below the injury, below level means below the injury in your spinal column, if he finds such electrical activity, if he ablates it either by cauterizing it or by resecting it, the pain goes away 85% of the time. It's a remarkable result. And the relief of pain is the third bullet up from the bottom, is permanent as far as we know. That is, he has never gotten pain relief from ablation or resection where it came back. An incredible result. It says here by itself, this paper is astounding. I'm a fan. I've learned more about neurobiology in the last 8 years or so working with him than anything I ever knew before, because I knew nothing before, so it was easy. This is a picture of what he means by electrically hyperactive spinal cord tissue. On the right, there's tissue that is not a lot of electrical activity. These are the same scales. And on the left is a hyper active spinal cord tissue. And those two traces are done right next to each other on something called, you're going to love this, the dorsal root entry zone, the DRES, another neurobiology word from Scott. And these things are right next to each other. And it's important to tell you something amazing. If the patient, remember, these are not mice, these are real patients who are thinking and feeling pain. And if the patient says, you know, the pain is coming from my left ankle, when Scott goes and looks in this spinal column with his little electrical measurement, he knows from hearing that the pain is from the patient's left ankle, where to look. And no matter who has pain coming from his or her left ankle, the electrical activity is in the same place along the spinal column. So he has a different kind of map of what's going on. And this is all in people below the, not all, but mostly people below the injury, and often people who have a completely severed spinal column. And so this is a kind of a insight, a beginning of an insight. And this is a busy slide. There you go. And it's better to get the slide if you care. This is a visualization of how a person who had been for years, had for many years been under enormous pain. When this electrically hyperactive tissue, identified as in the last slide, was resected or cauterized, the patient's pain largely went away permanently. And so this is really a repeat of what I've said before. We then switched for a moment to where we are, and you've seen all of these slides from Naboisha. In fact, you've seen them from both of us every time we get a chance to tell you about how we make somomers instead of aptamers, how we have six co-crystals, how Naboisha said in a seminar last week that I heard that most people, most graduate students wouldn't know which is the protein in this co-crystal and which is the somomer, because they both look like globular things and they look like they're very intimately arranged in the co-crystal with the binding about similar to the binding you would see in a monoclonal. By the way, the blue thing is the somomer, for those of you tired of guessing. And this slide Naboisha slowed, it's the same thing. And somehow we end up with a readout, and we measure today 7,000 proteins with great CVs and blah, blah, blah. And so now the question is, can we learn something about causality and do something because of data from SomaScan? Oh, we're trying to make it less expensive. You can read this slide yourself. It's my favorite slide ever. Naboisha, Jason Cleveland, and both of their groups are working really hard and have been for a long time to make SomaScan really cheap. The idea always has been from the beginning, I'm going to sneeze, always has been to make it so cheap that it's like a wearable is, for glucose or for whatever you want to do. And we're not there yet, but we're going to get there. We know we can get there. And so that's different than hoping we can get there. I think this idea is also a good idea. My favorite here is if you forgot to unzip, you have Alzheimer's. It's worth laughing. Um, so this just says the same thing before, and the bottom is the issue. Can you use tissue homogenites the way Naboisha did for tumors to learn something that may be better than mere correlation, which is also good? And that's where we're going right now for the last little part of this talk. So here is something you've seen before on the left, and the right is, so we're putting the two together, like I've already said, and we're hoping that there will be protein differences in the electrically hot activity versus hot tissue versus the adjacent and very similar looking to the naked eye cold tissue, which is not electrically active. And if there were lots of protein differences between the hot tissue and the cold tissue, you might get lucky and see something that gave you an idea of causality, maybe. And these are the same kind of data that Naboisha showed for a volcano plot. And the difference is that the upper quadrant in red are the data for proteins that are over abundant in the electrically hyperactive tissue that Scott had already shown by surgeries and ablations is causal. So you have in that box about 60 proteins that are elevated. There aren't so many over on the left that are down, similar, I think, to Du Bois's data for tumors. I'm not sure that I understand that fully, probably in either case. But Scott Fauci decided he would look at the 60 proteins carefully. We've had the data showing these 60 proteins that are elevated for about 2 years. And the idea was, are there any drugs against any of those 60 proteins that could be tried to eliminate pain in spinal cord injury patients who were experiencing awful pain? That's the question. And so one of the proteins, this protein called SV2A, is one of the 15 proteins of the 60 that already had drugs against them for other reasons. And when a drug exists and it's been FDA approved, a doc is allowed to use that drug for a purpose other than the purpose of that the drug was approved for. So, so that's what Scott did. And it says in the bottom in his compassionate use study that 8 people with awful pain were given orally active Briviact, the drug, you just eat it. And 5 of them had remarkable pain relief that Scott had never seen in his life as a neurosurgeon who prescribes drugs. And these patients' pain was refractory, all 8 of them, to pharmacological management, is what it says, by opioids, NSAIDs, Lyrica, Neurontin, antidepressants, whatever. And these are the things that everybody gets when they have this kind of neuropathic pain, and it never helps. And it turns out that for 5 of the 8 people, by self-reporting, something he had never seen. And it's better than that because, I'm going backwards for a minute, sorry. For opioids, for example, most of these people, these patients, were addicted to pretty high levels of opioids. So you were even worried about them not only being addicted, but doing harm to themselves. And in this group of 5 people whose pain was so diminished on a scale that doesn't mean it. It's certainly not a linear scale. In fact, it's not clear to me what this scale is really, except that down around 4 or 5, you are absolutely okay. You're not complaining about pain. You're back to thinking about paralysis, and even slight reduction on this odd scale from 10 to 8, for example, the top two, is very helpful for patients. But it's important to say that 5 of 8 responded to this drug, and it's made us in our thinking wonder whether we can get from proteomics and eventually, hopefully, blood plasma proteomics to figuring out what drugs people might need, since we have, in principle, 60 proteins in that upper quadrant that the volcano plot showed you, that where the drugs might be synergistic or not. And so here's here's what the patients were like over on the left, and what the results of this very small trial. I should say that Scott made an application to the NIH, and he has received a big chunk of money to test Briviact on a larger group of patients, perhaps about 20. And so there'll be more data, but these will always be small trials. They have to be. And so that's just a summary in blue of the exact. This is a slide deck in which everything is said 4 times. So I'm just realizing that as I'm showing them to you. So then here's a beginning of a second proof of concept. Why did we do a second one? Well, Scott could have been lucky. I mean, he's been reading and thinking about pain for a long time, and he might have looked at this thing, Briviact, and thought, yep, that's it, SV2A. That's it. I don't know how he got there. We've been friends for a long time. It seems impossible to me that he knew enough to pick one. It's really hard to do that when you're trying to find the causal guy in a correlated set. And then he did it again. He found target 2, which we've not told you about. I want to talk about that at the bottom of this slide. It's not me being secretive. It's something more important, I think. But this second thing, target 2, also had a drug against it. This drug was not an orally active drug. It was a monoclonal antibody. So if it's worked, and it did, 1 for 1, that probably means that the protein target is extracellular, whereas you can't tell with Briviact, the SV2A drug. And this thing was, because it's a drug for a thing that the patient actually also had, her doctor was allowed to prescribe it with no difficulties because she had that condition as well as suicidal pain. And the pain came down. 1 patient, 1 dose, apparently successful. So why are we not just making, you might ask, and I think you should ask, why don't we just publish this list of 60 and let pharma go after the 45, but for the 15 that already have drugs, let people get them prescribed. And we've kind of decided that it's unfair to do that. It's sort of like all the COVID drugs that are not drugs. We don't know. We just know that Scott may be 2 for 2. He's certainly 1 for 1 with Briviact, and the second one we'll do more of them. So we think there has to be a moment where this is laid out for docs and patients. But we think anyway, and we'd love to hear from you if you disagree, either at the end of today or some other time. Love to hear about how you would play this, because there seems to be ethics of either any kind going on in this discussion, and we're trying to figure it out. It's not easy for us. So this is a repeat of the same thing, and we're going to do both things. We're going to eventually get the drugs that should be tried, the 15, and they should be tried, and we should be able to tell the world, here's Scott, here's how they do these drugs for spinal cord injury induced pain. And then you could imagine making new drugs as either new chemical entities or biologics against the other 45. And of course, we know the pathways that these things are in or that people think they're in. And so we're going to have to be thoughtful about this. This is a reduction in dimensionality of the search. You went from 5,000 to 60. Um, and, uh, and it's pretty hard to know, even though it says this here. That's the word at the bottom bullet for the 3/4 of those sensible proteins. So it's really interesting. What's a sensible protein? Sensible protein means it agrees with your biases about the biochemistry that's going on. And we've had enough experience with SomaScan to be nervous that what seems sensible is not a good idea, that you have to be more open to the surprises that you find in biology, I think. So the, the, the reason that a company was formed is really to ask the question, can we help with more pain? Never mind that this is about a market, but this is about also helping lots of people. The numbers of kinds of people that have, the number of pain types is vast and nothing works very well. We would say that from reading, and Scott prescribes a lot of pain drugs in his practice, and it's very rare for a pain drug to do much, including opioids for pain. They work in early, but then they don't work very well later. And so this is a chance to wonder whether or not by accident, Scott's data and the pain problem that he attacked for 30 years, whether he's learned enough to be hopeful that we can help people with more pain than just the pain that comes, the awful pain that comes from spinal cord injuries. And so this is the same thing. Again, it's another duplicate with different words. And it says we sort of recapitulated his surgery at the level of proteins. And that's a kind of remarkable thing. It didn't have to be that way. It could have been anything. We had no idea. He had put aside the tissue from his resections so that somebody could look. And eventually, because he was in Denver, somebody suggested to Scott that he come up and visit with us. And he had the tissues in the freezer. And so it was easy for us to do that work. And then we got so much data to think about. We've spent more than 2 years trying to understand the data from essentially one experiment. Okay? That's kind of interesting. And this is the last slide, which is essentially how we went from the same thing, neurosurgery to proteomics, to maybe the causal proteins, the data being that drugs work so far. It's still early, but we're very, very optimistic. Thanks.